The call came in at 9:30 on a Thursday evening, and I almost didn't pick up. I was sitting in my sister's kitchen in Fredericton, the two of us having tea and watching the snow come down outside her window, the way it does in February, slow and heavy and indifferent to everything. My phone buzzed on the table and I saw my son's name. I thought nothing of it. He called on Thursdays sometimes just to check in. But the moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't what he said. It was the way he was breathing. "Dad," that was all, just my name, and then a long pause. "I'm here," I said. "She's at the storage unit." I set down my mug. My sister looked at me from across the table, and I held up one finger. "Which one?" I asked, though I already knew. "The one on Heartland Drive, the one you never told me about." I sat very still. Outside, the snow kept falling. My sister mouthed the words, "Is everything okay?" And I nodded slowly, though nothing about the next hour was going to be okay. "How did she find it?" I asked. "I don't know, Dad. She went through some old papers in the filing cabinet. She found a receipt." He exhaled. "She called a locksmith. I tried to stop her, but she said it's marital property. She said she has a right." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I had been waiting for this exact moment for almost 2 years, and now that it had arrived, I felt something I did not expect. Not panic, not anger, but a deep, settled calm. The kind that comes when the thing you've been dreading finally shows up at the door and you realize you've been ready for it all along. "Don't do anything," I said to my son. "Don't argue with her. Let her go." "Dad." "Let her go. I'll explain everything. Just trust me." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Okay." I hung up and sat with my hands folded on the table and told my sister I needed to make a few phone calls. She asked no questions. She's known me for 64 years. She knows when I have things in hand. I should tell you about my son first, because none of this makes sense without him. His name is Callum. He turned 38 last October, and he is, in most ways, exactly the kind of man I hoped he would become. He took over the landscaping business I built from nothing in the 90s, and he runs it better than I ever did. He's reliable. He's honest. He remembers people's names and their dogs' names and their kids' birthdays. He got that from his mother, God rest her. She passed 11 years ago. A stroke, sudden. The kind that gives you no warning and no time to say the things you need to say. Callum was 27. It hit him hard, harder than he ever let on to me, I think. He met Stacy about 3 years after his mother died. She worked at the accounting firm that did our business taxes. She was sharp, well-dressed, knew how to carry herself in a room. I noticed on their first date, he brought her to Sunday dinner at my house in Riverview, that she asked about the house before she asked about him. Where was it located? What was the square footage? Had I done renovations recently? She held her wine glass by the stem and looked around my living room in a way that was less like admiring and more like appraising. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man. But then she started asking Callum about my retirement accounts. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you could dismiss. She mentioned to Callum over dinner one night that, with interest rates the way they were, it might be smart to consolidate assets. She suggested that since I was getting on in years, it might be worth thinking about estate planning as a family. She asked Callum once, very casually, whether I had a will and who the executor was. Callum told me about these conversations because he tells me everything. He's always been like that. Even when he was a teenager, he'd come and sit on the edge of my bed at night and just talk. I've always been grateful for that. I'm getting ahead of myself. She asked him to move into my house 8 months after they started dating. My house on Carling Street has 4 bedrooms, a double garage, and a backyard that runs down to the creek. It's the house I bought when Callum was 4 years old. It's the house where his mother's garden still grows every spring, the roses she planted along the fence, the crabapple tree she chose herself at the nursery in Quispamsis. I have no intention of selling it, and I have no intention of sharing it with someone I do not trust. I said no. I said it kindly, but clearly. I told Callum that I was happy to have them for dinners and holidays, but that I was not ready to have anyone move in. He understood. She did not. After that, something changed. She became more pointed in her questions, more direct with Callum about what he stood to inherit. She told him once, he told me this himself, that he should have a clearer sense of what was coming to him so they could plan their future properly. She pushed him to ask me to put the house in both their names. She suggested Callum become a co-signatory on my investment accounts, just in case something happened to me. Callum said no to all of it. He told her my affairs were my own business, and he had no interest in being involved in them until I asked him to be. I was proud of him for that. Genuinely proud. But she didn't stop. She just got quieter about it, which is worse. I had opened the storage unit on Heartland Drive 18 months earlier. I want to be clear about that. I opened it with intention. I knew what I was doing, and I knew why. I have spent 40 years in this country building something. I came to New Brunswick from Scotland when I was 22 with one duffel bag and a cousin's address written on a scrap of paper. I worked construction for 7 years before I saved enough to start my own landscaping operation. I drove the truck myself for the first 3 years. I did the payroll at the kitchen table. I signed every check. My wife raised Callum and worked part-time at the library and made our house a home while I built something that would one day be worth passing on. I will not have it dismantled by someone who arrived at the table after everything was already made. The storage unit contained, among other things, a series of documents I had spent 18 months quietly assembling. The house on Carling Street had been placed in a family trust 4 months after Callum introduced Stacy to me. The trust was established with the help of my lawyer, a woman named Maureen, who has done my legal work for 2 decades and who, when I explained the situation to her, said only, "Good, let's do this right." The trust meant that the house was no longer my personal asset. It belonged to the trust. Callum was the beneficiary. Any spouse of Callum's would have no direct claim to it without a court challenge that would require proving I had acted in bad faith, which I had not. I had also reorganized my registered accounts in ways that were entirely legal, entirely transparent to the CRA, and entirely protected from a potential divorce settlement. I had updated my beneficiary designations. I had written a detailed letter to Callum explaining every decision I had made and why, to be opened in the event of my death, or, as Maureen suggested, in the event of circumstances like the ones we now found ourselves in. That letter was in a sealed envelope inside the storage unit on Heartland Drive. Along with it were the statements, the trust documents, the updated will, and a small leather notebook, not a journal in any dramatic sense, just the kind of notebook a careful man keeps, names, dates, conversations, things I had observed, things Callum had shared with me, written down not out of malice but out of habit. I have always been a man who writes things down. If Stacy was planning to argue that I had hidden assets from Callum, the notebook would tell a different story. Every conversation, every request, every question she had asked about my finances through Callum was recorded, dated, and noted. I had not built this because I wanted a fight. I had built it because I wanted my son to be protected if the fight came to him. I flew back to Moncton the next morning. Callum picked me up at the airport and we drove to a coffee shop on Main Street and sat in a booth by the window and I told him everything. I had worried about this conversation. I had rehearsed versions of it in my head for months. But when I looked at my son across the table, tired, a little pale, holding his coffee with both hands the way he used to hold his hot chocolate when he was small, I didn't reach for any of the rehearsed words. I just told him the truth, what I had done, why I had done it, what the trust meant for him, what the notebook contained, what I had seen in Stacy that he, because he loved her, had not allowed himself to see. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. "I knew," he said finally. "I think I knew something was off. I kept telling myself I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," I said. "You were just hoping." He looked out the window. It had stopped snowing by then, and the street was bright with morning light on fresh white. "What was in the unit?" he asked. "What did she find?" "The trust documents, the letter I wrote you, the notebook." I paused. and a handwritten list of every time she asked you to find out something about my finances. She'll say it means nothing. She can say whatever she likes, I said. The house is in the trust. The accounts are structured correctly. She's welcome to consult a lawyer if she wants to challenge any of it. Maureen says she won't get far. He was quiet again. Then he said, "She left this morning. She packed 2 bags. She said I could call her when I was ready to talk about our future and what it actually looked like." I didn't say anything to that. "I'm not going to call her," he said. I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm, the way I used to when he was a boy, and something had hurt him. He looked down at the table and his jaw tightened the way men's jaws do when they are trying very hard not to cry. "You're going to be all right," I said. "I promise you that." What I didn't expect was the call from Stacy herself. She phoned me 3 days later while I was at the house on Carling Street going through some paperwork. The number came up as unknown, but I had a feeling, and I answered. "You had no right," she said. The pleasantries were gone. The firm handshake voice was gone. What was left was something harder and less careful. "Good afternoon," I said. "That storage unit, those documents. You did this on purpose. You set all of this up to push me out of Callum's life." "I set all of this up," I said, "to protect my son and the assets I spent 40 years building. The two things are not the same. He loves me." "He may," I said, "but love isn't the same as trust, and you gave him very little reason to trust you." She was quiet for a moment. "This isn't over," she said. "That's up to you," I told her, "but you should speak to a lawyer before you decide. And you should ask that lawyer to explain to you what a family trust means, and what a beneficiary designation means, and what the difference is between a marital asset and an asset held in trust. I think it'll save you some time." She hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet of the house. The afternoon light was coming through the window over the sink, the same window where my wife used to stand and watch Callum play in the backyard when he was small. I looked at the fence line and at the bare canes of the rose bushes, waiting for spring the way they always do. I thought about my wife, about how she would have handled this. She would have handled it differently, more warmly, probably more generously. She always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt longer than I did, but she also would have protected our son. Of that I have no doubt. Callum filed for divorce 4 months later. It was not a long process. The prenuptial agreement, which I quietly encouraged Callum to put in place before the wedding and which Stacy had signed without reading carefully, I suspect because she assumed there would be time to renegotiate later, made most of the financial questions simple. Maureen referred Callum to a family lawyer she trusted. Stacy retained her own. There were a few letters exchanged, a few weeks of negotiations. In the end, it was settled without a courtroom. The house on Carling Street stayed in the trust. The business stayed with Callum. She received what the prenuptial agreement entitled her to, which was considerably less than she had planned for, I imagine. Callum told me afterward that her lawyer had asked during negotiations whether the storage unit documents could be challenged on the grounds that they had been prepared with intent to deprive a spouse of marital assets. Maureen's response, which she relayed to me with what I can only describe as quiet satisfaction, was brief. The trust had been established before the marriage, the accounts had been structured in full compliance with federal and provincial law, and the notebook was not a legal document but a personal record, admissible or not as the court saw fit. The challenge went nowhere. What struck me, sitting with all of this afterward, was how little anger I felt. I had expected, when it was over, to feel some version of triumph. I didn't. What I felt was something quieter than that. Relief, mostly. And something like grief, not for Stacy, but for Callum, for the years he had spent with someone who had been calculating, in the background, while he was simply trying to love her. That's a particular kind of loneliness, to find out afterward that someone was never quite present the way you thought they were. He's doing well now. Better than well, actually. He threw himself back into the business in a way he hadn't in a couple of years, and the company had its best summer since he took it over. He hired 2 new crew members and picked up 3 large commercial contracts in the Riverview area. He runs 5 days a week along the river trail in the mornings, which he'd stopped doing during the marriage. I'm not sure why. He's been coming to dinner on Sunday again, which I had missed more than I admitted to myself. We sit at the same table where I told him the truth about what I had done, and we eat and talk about nothing consequential, the business, the hockey season, a book one of us has read. Sometimes he stays for an hour, sometimes for 3. Last Sunday he helped me move some furniture in the spare room, and we had a beer afterward, sitting on the back steps looking out at the yard, and I thought, this is the thing. This is the thing she never saw because she was always looking somewhere else. The rose bushes came back in June, the way they always do. The crabapple tree his mother chose bloomed early this year. The yard looks exactly the way it looked when Callum was 4 years old, and I signed the papers on this house and thought, for the first time in my life I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I had not hidden what was in that storage unit to punish anyone. I had put it there so that no matter what happened, the things that mattered would survive it. And they did. That is all I ever wanted. I think about the rose bushes sometimes when I'm trying to make sense of all of it. My wife planted them the spring after we moved in. She didn't plant them because she thought they'd be worth something. She planted them because she wanted something beautiful to come back every year, reliably, without being asked. That's what she was like. And that's what I kept coming back to, sitting on those back steps with Callum last summer, drinking a beer in the quiet. There are things in life that grow back because they were rooted properly to begin with, and there are things that collapse the moment the conditions change because they were never really planted. They were just placed on top of the soil and held there by circumstance. Stacy was the second kind. I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say it because it's true, and because I spent a long time watching someone present themselves as solid when they were underneath, just waiting for the ground to shift. What I learned, what Callum learned, I think, in a way that will stay with him, is that you can't love someone into being trustworthy. You can love them completely and generously and without reservation, and if they are not honest, that love will not change them. It will only make you more exposed. Callum's instincts were right from early on. He told me himself he knew something was off. He just kept hoping he was wrong. There is nothing shameful in that. That's what a decent person does. They give the benefit of the doubt because they themselves would not behave badly, and so they can't quite believe someone else would either. But decency without discernment will cost you. That's the part I had to learn the hard way in my own life, long before Stacy ever sat at my dinner table. You have to be good, genuinely good, honest with people, fair in your dealings, the kind of man who can look at himself clearly, and you also have to be clear-eyed. The two things are not opposites. Kindness is not the same as naivety. A good heart and a sharp mind can live in the same person. They have to, or the world will find you eventually. And then there is the third thing, the one nobody talks about much because it isn't dramatic, just staying with it. Doing the quiet, unglamorous work of protecting what you've built month after month in ways that nobody sees. The trust documents, the meetings with Maureen, the notebook I kept for a year and a half, writing things down in the evenings after dinner. None of that felt important while I was doing it. It felt like paperwork. It felt like caution taken too far. But when the moment came, when Callum called me from the airport parking lot, exhausted and a little lost, all of that quiet preparation was the only reason I could tell him, it's going to be all right. I had done the work before it was needed. That's the only time you can do it. I am 64 years old. I came to this country with nothing. Everything I have was made slowly, carefully, one decent decision at a time. I would not have it any other way. And when I watch Callum running along the river trail in the mornings, when he comes for Sunday dinner and stays longer than he planned, when he laughs at something I say and the room feels the way it used to feel, I think, yes, that is what it was all for. Not the house, not the accounts, not the trust documents sitting in a filing cabinet at Maureen's office. That laugh, that Sunday evening, that is the only legacy that ever truly mattered.